I did not cry when I walked out of the Galactic Conclave chamber. I did not raise my voice. I did not even look back at the 30 species who had just voted to reclassify all of humanity as a developing civilization, a polite phrase that meant, in the language of galactic law, that we were no longer considered full partners. We were, by the stroke of a data slate, to be treated as children who needed guidance rather than adults who deserved a seat at the table. I simply closed my data slate, stood up, and read the statement I had been carrying in my coat pocket for 11 months. My name is Claire Ellison. I was, at that time, the senior human diplomatic attaché to the Conclave of Allied Worlds. I had held that position for 9 years. I had learned 6 alien languages, mediated 4 interspecies trade disputes, and spent more nights sleeping in the curved, oddly lit chambers of that great spire than I had spent in my own home on Earth. And on the day that 30 alien species decided humanity was not worth full representation, I folded my hands on the table, looked at the hall full of beings who had tolerated us at their lowest bench for decades, and I read the following. The government of Earth and all human-administered territories hereby withdraws from all treaties, trade agreements, defense pacts, and cooperative frameworks maintained under the Conclave of Allied Worlds. This withdrawal is effective immediately. We thank the member species for their decades of partnership and wish them well in their future endeavors. That was the whole statement. 47 words. The laughter started somewhere in the upper tiers. It was a strange sound, several species at once, their different vocal patterns overlapping into something that felt, in every language, the same. Dismissal. The kind of sound you make when something small and confused has done something you find more amusing than threatening. The Veth High Speaker, a tall, silver-skinned figure named Orath Tel who had chaired the session, leaned slightly toward his translation module and said, loud enough that the entire chamber could hear, that this was like a child leaving the dinner table because they did not like the meal. I looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then I turned and walked toward the exit. The hall was enormous. It had been designed that way deliberately, wide enough to hold the ambassadors of 30 civilizations, high enough that the ceiling was lost in a soft, engineered haze of light. Every surface was polished to a reflective shine, so that as you walked, you could see yourself from a dozen angles at once. I had always found it oppressive. On that day, for the first time, I found it beautiful, because every step I took away from that table was reflected back at me 30 times over, and I looked very calm. I was not calm. Beneath my ribs, something was wound very tight. Not anger, or not only anger. It was closer to the feeling you get when you have been holding your breath for a long time, and you are finally allowed to exhale. 9 years of being spoken over. 9 years of human proposals being adopted without credit. Human science being integrated into conclave infrastructure without acknowledgement. Human diplomats being assigned the lowest bench in the chamber as a matter of protocol, because when the seating order had been established 200 years ago, humanity had not yet been admitted, and no one had ever seen fit to revise it. The door at the end of the hall was a set of wide panels that opened automatically as you approached. I could hear the chamber behind me. The laughter had died down and something else had taken its place. Not silence exactly. More like the particular quality of sound that happens when a large group of people suddenly realize that the thing they found funny might not have been a joke. I did not give them the satisfaction of looking back. I stepped through the door, and it closed behind me with a sound I have never forgotten. Not a slam, not a dramatic clang of finality, just a soft, pneumatic sigh, like the last breath of something. And then the sound of the chamber was gone entirely, and I was standing in the long access corridor that led to the human embassy section of the conclave spire, and it was very quiet. My deputy, a man named Gregory Hale, was waiting in the corridor. He had been watching the session feed on a hand screen. When he saw my face, he did not say anything. He just fell into step beside me, which was the correct response and the reason I had kept him beside me for 4 of my 9 years. We walked in silence for almost a minute. "That's done then," Gregory said. "That's done," I agreed. "The relay will have transmitted the withdrawal notice to every conclave station at the same moment you read it. Legally, it is already effective. I know. The shuttle is ready on pad 7. Earth is expecting your call within the hour. I know that too." We turned a corner and passed a window, one of the long, curved observation panels that lined the outer wall of the spire, and looked out over the space station surrounding it. Beyond the station was the dark, and in the dark were the ship lanes that connected this place to 30 homeworlds and hundreds of colony systems. Many of those lanes had been built with human-designed navigational technology. Several of the fuel depot systems were operating on human-developed compression algorithms. The communications network that the Conclave used for its daily broadcasts had been expanded and stabilized, 12 years ago, by a team of human engineers who had taken 18 months to redesign the relay architecture from scratch, because the original system had kept dropping signals across the outer sectors. No one had put a plaque up. No one had sent a formal thank you. The work had been absorbed into the infrastructure and become invisible, the way that the work of the people the galaxy undervalues always becomes invisible. I looked at those ship lanes for a moment, just a moment. Then I kept walking. At the shuttle pad, I paused before boarding. The pad was a wide, open platform on the outer edge of the spire, enclosed in a transparent environmental field that kept the vacuum out while letting you feel, in some small way, the scale of the space around you. The stars out there were cold and very far away, and very indifferent, and I had always loved them for that. Gregory was still beside me. He was looking at the same view. "They think we'll come back," he said. Not a question, a statement. "Yes," I said. "They think we'll realize we need them more than they need us." "Do we?" I thought about the 11 months I had spent helping draft the withdrawal plan, the quiet rooms full of economists, engineers, medical researchers, and communication specialists who had mapped, in exhaustive detail, every point at which the Conclave's infrastructure touched human knowledge, human labor, or human goodwill. The document they had produced was 600 pages long and had been classified at the highest level. I had read every page twice. "No," I said, "we don't." I boarded the shuttle. As it pulled away from the spire, I looked back once through the rear observation window. The Conclave spire was enormous. It always looked enormous from the outside, a structure built to communicate power, permanence, the impression that it had always been there and always would be. I thought, they should have wondered why we were so calm. They should have asked themselves, in those 9 years of looking down from the upper tiers, why the human delegation never raised their voices, never stormed out of sessions, never threatened retaliation even when our motions were blocked for the 4th or 5th time in a row. They should have noticed that the calmness was not weakness. They should have understood that a species capable of patience, real patience, the kind built from centuries of learning how to survive on a single, fragile planet against every conceivable obstacle, does not become calm because it has no other options. It becomes calm because it has already decided what it is going to do. The stars held still outside the window. The shuttle moved. The spire shrank. I turned away from it. There was work to do. 6 months after I walked out of that chamber, I had an office on the 14th floor of a building in Geneva that smelled like recycled air and old data cartridges. The office was not glamorous. It had a desk, 2 screens, a window that looked out over a gray autumn sky, and a door that people knocked on approximately 40 times a day to bring me reports I had already half anticipated. The office belonged to the Bureau of Galactic Disengagement, which was the official name for what the wider public had started calling, somewhat affectionately, the Quiet Department. It had been established 3 weeks after the withdrawal, staffed by a rotating team of roughly 400 people, drawn from every relevant field, and its mandate was precise: to identify, document, and methodically conclude every point of connection between human civilization and the conclave of allied worlds. It was, in practice, the most complicated administrative undertaking in human history, not because it was technically difficult, though it was that too, but because of what it revealed, piece by piece, as the work proceeded. Every morning I came in, poured a cup of coffee that was never quite hot enough, sat down at my desk, and opened the daily summary. And every morning, the daily summary told me something new about the scale of what humanity had been providing to the galaxy, without ever being properly credited for it. My deputy director was a man named Owen Price. He had been an economist before the Bureau, specializing in interspecies trade flow analysis, and he had a gift for delivering devastating information in a tone so flat and measured that it took a moment to understand what he had actually said. He was the one who told me, on a Tuesday morning in November, that the Conclave's FTL relay network was beginning to degrade. He said it the way you might say that a meeting had been rescheduled. I looked up from my screen. How quickly? Signal integrity on the outer sectors is already down 11%. The inner routes are holding, but the maintenance cycle for the graviton compression nodes is due in 4 months, and the Conclave doesn't have anyone who knows how to run it. The graviton compression nodes were the core of the relay network's stability. They had been designed, originally, by a human engineer named Paul Sutton, who had spent 6 years developing the system in collaboration with the Conclave's technical division. When the system had been completed and integrated, Paul had been given a small commemorative medal by the Conclave's Infrastructure Committee and then politely excluded from the follow-up maintenance contracts, which had gone to a Veth-owned technical firm. The Veth firm had relied, for 12 years, on the documentation Paul's team had produced, documentation written in a human technical dialect that the Veth firm had never fully translated into their own working frameworks, because they had assumed the documentation would always be available and the humans who wrote it would always be, in some sense, on call. They were no longer on call. What happens if the maintenance cycle doesn't run? I asked. Owen tilted his head slightly. Signal degradation continues. Estimated cascade failure across the outer relay chain within 14 months. Inner routes hold longer, maybe 3 years, but without the outer network, 11 of the 30 member worlds are functionally cut off from the inner conclave communication grid. I wrote a note on my pad, not because I needed to remember it, I would, but because the act of writing helped me think. Who knows this on their end? Their technical directorate. They sent an informal query to our science liaison office last week, asking if we'd be willing to consult. And the science liaison office responded. They referred the query to us, per protocol. I nodded. Per protocol meant no response, which was not the same as a refusal. It was simply a redirect that led, in practice, to a very long wait. The protocol had been designed that way. Log it and continue, I said. Owen nodded and left without another word. This was, I want to be clear, not cruelty. I thought about that often in those months, sitting in my slightly too cold office with my slightly too cool coffee, reading reports about supply chains fracturing and infrastructure cycles going unserviced. It would have been easy to feel something dark about it, a kind of satisfaction that the people who had laughed in that chamber were now discovering what their laughter had cost them. I would be a liar if I said that feeling never crossed my mind. But it was not the dominant feeling, and it was not what drove the work. What drove the work was the knowledge of what had been decided, 12 years ago, in a classified session of the Conclave's Internal Affairs Committee. I had seen the document 4 months before the withdrawal vote. One of our intelligence analysts, a quiet young woman named Frances Cole, had flagged it in a weekly brief with a note that said only, "You should read this personally." I had read it in a secure room with the door closed and the feed disabled. It was 40 pages long, written in formal conclave bureaucratic language, and it was a proposal, a serious, committee-approved, formally minuted proposal, to limit humanity's access to certain categories of advanced scientific research, on the grounds that human cognitive and social development was progressing faster than was, in the committee's view, desirable for the stability of the conclave's existing power structure. The proposal had not passed. It had been tabled indefinitely, which in conclave administrative language meant it had been shelved, without being rejected, available to be revived at any future session. The vote to classify humanity as a developing civilization 6 months later had used different language, but the logic underneath it was the same. They had not wanted to destroy us. They had wanted to keep us manageable. I thought about that document often. I thought about it when I read about the degrading relay network. I thought about it when Owen came in on a Wednesday with the pharmaceutical report. The pharmaceutical report was, of the many difficult things I read that year, the one that stayed with me longest. Not because it was the worst, but because it was the most personal. 17 species had, over the course of 4 decades, incorporated human-derived medical compounds into their standard treatment protocols for conditions their own biologists had never been able to fully address. Some of these conditions were minor, some were not. The compounds had been developed by human research teams, shared freely as part of the Conclave's scientific cooperation framework, and integrated so thoroughly into the medical infrastructure of the receiving species that they had stopped thinking of them as human contributions at all. They had become simply part of the system. Background, infrastructure, something that had always been there. Human research teams were no longer sharing updates. The existing compounds remained in circulation. We had not revoked access to anything already distributed, but the pipeline of new research, new treatments, improved formulations, had stopped, quietly, without announcement. Owen presented this report with his usual flatness and then added, at the end, in the same tone he used for everything, "There will be consequences for some patient populations, particularly in the Dranathi outer colonies, where the dependency on human-developed treatments for the respiratory condition they call the gray narrowing is highest." I sat with that for a moment. "Is there anything we can do," I said carefully, "within protocol, to flag to our medical researchers that the Dranathi colony situation warrants attention for possible future humanitarian consideration?" Owen looked at me. "I can send an internal memo." "Please do." This was the line I walked every day in that office. The withdrawal was not a declaration of war. It was not designed to cause suffering. It was designed to cause reckoning. A clear, undeniable demonstration, in real and practical terms, of what the galaxy had been taking from us without acknowledgement. But demonstrations have consequences, and I was not willing to let those consequences fall on populations who had never voted for the policies that made this necessary. The senior conclave leadership had voted. The high-tier species representatives had laughed. The patients in the Dranathi outer colonies had done neither. Frances Cole knocked on my door at 2:30 that afternoon with a data chip and an expression that I had learned to read as meaning she had found something. She sat down across from me and placed the chip on the desk. "This is a summary of conclave communication intercepts from the past 3 weeks. The interesting traffic is on channels 4 through 9. I slotted the chip into my reader. The intercepts were dense. Long exchanges in Veth diplomatic code that our translation systems had partially decoded. The substance of them was this: the Veth Dominion, which had been in the middle of an expansion campaign in the outer sectors, was encountering serious logistical problems. Their military supply routes ran through a network of jump corridors that had been mapped and certified by human navigational teams over a period of 20 years. The certification was regularly renewed, or had been regularly renewed, by a human technical agency that operated under a conclave cooperative mandate. That mandate had expired with the withdrawal. The certification renewal process had simply stopped. And without renewed certification, the jump corridors were technically unregistered under conclave space law, which meant that Veth military vessels using them were operating outside authorized transit zones, which their own legal department had flagged as a liability. Orath Tell, the high speaker who had compared humanity to a child leaving a dinner table, was, according to the intercepts, in a very difficult series of conversations with his own military command. I handed the chip back to Frances. "Continue monitoring." She nodded and left. I went back to my reports. There were always more reports. My daughter called me that evening, as she usually did when I was working late in Geneva. Her name was Nina, and she was 11 years old, and she was living with her grandmother in Edinburgh, while the world we all lived in quietly rearranged itself in ways that were not yet visible on the surface, but were already very deep. She called me on a standard home link, and her face on the screen was round and curious, and unbothered in the way that children's faces are when they have not yet learned to perform concern. "Mum," she said, "are we ever going back to the stars?" I had been expecting this question for months. I had thought about how to answer it. "We're already there," I told her. "We just stopped sharing the view." She considered this with the particular seriousness that 11-year-olds apply to things they do not entirely understand, but can tell are important. "Does that mean the aliens are cross with us?" "Some of them are confused," I said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "When someone is cross with you, they know what you did. When someone is confused, they're still figuring it out." She thought about this. "And when they figure it out, then we'll have a conversation," I said. "A proper one, for the first time." She seemed to find this satisfying enough. We talked for a while longer about her school, and the book she was reading, and the stray cat that had adopted my mother's garden, and then she signed off, and I was alone again in my office, with the gray Geneva night outside the window, and the stack of reports waiting on my desk. I pulled the next one from the pile. It was a breakdown of human contributions to the Conclave's agricultural distribution network, compiled by a team of 6 analysts who had been working on it for 2 months. The document was 230 pages long. I opened it to page 1 and began to read. The work was not glamorous, but it was, I was becoming increasingly certain, the most important thing I had ever done, not because of what it was dismantling, because of what it was making visible. Every severed connection, every expired contract, every silent notification of withdrawal sent to a Conclave administrative office, each one was a light being turned on in a room that had been kept conveniently dark for a very long time. We were not leaving the galaxy. We were finally making it see us clearly. 2 years after the withdrawal, I stopped being a bureaucrat and became something closer to a strategist. The title on my door did not change. I was still the director of the Bureau of Galactic Disengagement, but the nature of the work had shifted. The initial phase, the careful, methodical severing of connections, was largely complete. What remained was the monitoring, the analysis, and the very precise task of understanding what was happening out there, and making sure that what was happening served the purpose we had set out to achieve. The purpose had never been destruction. I want to be clear about that. Even now, even knowing what the next 3 years looked like, the purpose was accountability. The purpose was to create a situation in which the species that had spent decades treating humanity as a useful convenience rather than a genuine partner were forced to confront, in terms they could not dismiss or reclassify, exactly what that convenience had cost them. We were making that very clear. Owen Price came into my office on a Monday morning in early spring with a coffee. His own, because he had learned not to bring me cups that would go cold, and a briefing that he delivered in 3 sentences. The Veth Dominion's outer expansion campaign has stalled completely. Their command has formally suspended operations in sectors 12 through 19. Internal Conclave communications indicate that the jump corridor problem has escalated to the level of the Dominion's senior council. I poured my own coffee, which was at least hot when I made it myself. What's their proposed solution? They've commissioned a study. I looked at him. A study, he repeated, with the particular flatness he reserved for information he found almost too absurd to convey. A 14-month independent assessment of alternative navigational certification pathways. 14 months. The Veth military campaign that had been quietly annexing resource-rich territories in the outer sectors, a campaign that had been made possible, in part, by jump corridor infrastructure certified by human technical teams, had been suspended, and the response was a 14-month study. I thought about the communities in those outer sectors. I thought about the fact that the expansion campaign had been one of the primary grievances cited in the internal human diplomatic reports that had built the case for withdrawal. The Conclave had not only failed to stop it, they had refused to allow it onto the formal session agenda 3 times in 4 years, citing it as an internal Veth matter. With the campaign now stalled, those outer sector communities had something they had not had in years: time. What else? I said. Owen sat down and opened his briefing sheet. The relay network degradation was continuing on the projected curve. Signal integrity in the outer sectors was now down 23%, and 2 of the smaller member species whose communication infrastructure ran entirely through the outer relay chain had formally petitioned the Conclave's Technical Committee for emergency assistance. The Conclave's Technical Committee had met and issued a statement expressing concern and pledging to explore options. Francis Cole's intelligence team was tracking those meetings carefully. There was an open-frequency broadcast from the Conclave 2 days ago, Owen continued. Emergency session. You should see it. He slid a data chip across the desk. I slotted it in. The broadcast was exactly what I had expected, and still, watching it, something in me went very still and very attentive. Oreth Tel was no longer the high speaker. He had been replaced 8 months ago, as the consequences of the withdrawal began to compound, by a figure from the Kasari delegation named Vel Amara, who was by all accounts a more competent administrator and a significantly less theatrical personality. But the content of the emergency session was not calm, regardless of who was running it. Representatives from 11 member species spoke during the session. 6 of them addressed the relay network. 3 addressed supply chain disruptions. Two addressed the pharmaceutical situation. Every single one of them used language that placed the cause of these problems outside themselves. Phrases like the disruption caused by human withdrawal and the consequences of humanity's unilateral action, as if the withdrawal had happened spontaneously, without cause, without 12 years of documented provocation. I watched in silence. Then one of the representatives, a small, gray-green figure from a species called the Thari, who had always been, in my experience, the most straightforwardly honest voices in the chamber, stood up and said something different. The Thari representative said, "We should discuss what we did to cause this." The chamber went noticeably quiet. The High Speaker thanked the Thari representative for her perspective and moved on to the next item on the agenda. I watched that moment 3 times. I noted the Thari representative's name. It translated, roughly, as something like soft stone, which was the naming convention for senior Thari diplomats. I filed it away. The broadcast ended. I handed the chip back to Owen. "Has there been any formal communication from the conclave to our liaison points?" I asked. "One," Owen said. "A private channel request, from the office of the High Speaker. Opened. No. Logged and held, per protocol." Per protocol. The request would sit in a queue that was technically monitored and practically unattended. Eventually, when we were ready, when the time was right, when the conditions were different, it would be addressed. Not before. "Good," I said. On a Tuesday in April, a conclave delegation arrived at the edge of human space. Not a military delegation, a diplomatic one. 3 vessels in civilian configuration, broadcasting a standard diplomatic approach signal on all channels. They held position at the outer boundary marker and sent a formal request to enter human-administered space for the purpose of reopening dialogue. I was in a meeting with the full Bureau leadership team when the news came in. I read the notification, set it face down on the table, and finished the meeting. Afterward, I authorized the response. The delegation would not be admitted. They would be greeted by a set of automated communication buoys we had positioned at that boundary for exactly this eventuality. The buoys would broadcast a single audio file. The file was 23 seconds long. It was a recording taken from the conclave chamber on the day of the withdrawal vote, beginning at the moment the motion passed and running through Orath Tel's comment about the child at the dinner table. You could hear the laughter of 30 alien species. You could hear, faintly, the sound of a chair being pushed back as I stood up. And then, after my 47-word statement, you could hear the silence that followed. 23 seconds. After the audio file finished, the buoys went dark. I received a report on the delegation's response 40 minutes later. They had held position for 6 hours, attempting repeated contact with our liaison channels. Then they had turned around and left. My senior communications officer, a woman named Helen Marsh, came to find me that evening. She was one of the few people in the Bureau who sometimes pushed back, and I valued that in her. She stood in my doorway and looked at me with an expression that was careful and a little troubled. "The buoy response," she said. "Is that the right message to send?" "What message do you think it sends?" I asked. She thought about it. "That we remember." "Yes. Some of them had nothing to do with that vote," she said. "The delegation they sent. 2 of those vessels were from the Thari and the Kasari. Neither of them voted for the motion." She was right. I had already checked. "The Thari and the Kasari sat in that chamber," I said. "They heard that laughter. They could have walked out in solidarity. They didn't." Helen was quiet for a moment. "So we're holding them accountable for what they didn't do, as much as for what they did." "We're holding them accountable for what the conclave did," I said. "They are the conclave. Until they decide to be something different, they arrive together." She considered this. "And when they decide to be something different? Then we'll talk about it." She nodded slowly. I could tell she was not entirely satisfied, but she was thinking about it seriously, which was all I asked. She went back to her office. I sat alone for a while. The classified document that Francis had found, the one about limiting human scientific development, had been on my mind again that afternoon. I thought about it the way you sometimes think about a scar. Not with pain exactly, but with a particular, clear attention. The conclave had decided, 12 years ago, that humanity was growing too fast, learning too much, becoming too capable. They had decided this not because we were a threat to them. We were not aggressive, had not been aggressive, had spent 9 years in their chamber trying to find common ground, but because capability, in the calculus of the existing power structure, was its own kind of threat. A species that knew as much as we knew, that could build what we could build, that could survive what we had survived, was a species that would eventually stop needing anyone's permission to do anything. They had wanted to keep us at the table because we were useful, but they had wanted to keep us at the lowest bench because a species at the lowest bench does not set the agenda. I had been very calm, walking out of that chamber. I was still calm, but the calm had a quality to it now that had not been there before. It was the calm of something finished. Not finished in the sense of over, but finished in the sense of decided. We had made our choice. The galaxy was beginning to feel it. And however long this took, another 2 years, another 5, another decade, we were not going back to the lowest bench. Not ever again. 5 years after the day I read those 47 words in the conclave chamber, I was on a ship. Not a diplomatic vessel, not a military escort, not one of the large transport carriers that had been moving human infrastructure components out of jointly operated stations for the past 4 years. This was an exploration vessel, a long, narrow ship called the Arlen Cross, built in the shipyards above Auckland, and crewed by 61 people whose job was to go beyond the outer edge of conclave-mapped space and find out what was there. I was not part of the crew. I was an observer, invited by the expedition's lead scientist, a man named Calvin Bryce, who had been lobbying the Bureau for access to senior-level strategic context for 8 months, before I agreed to spend 3 weeks aboard. He wanted to understand, he said, how the political situation shaped what they were likely to find out there. I wanted to see, with my own eyes, what was beyond the map. The Arlen Cross moved through regions of space that no conclave vessel had ever charted. The navigational team worked from raw data, building new maps in real time, naming things with the careful provisional names that explorers use when they know they are the first to see something and want to honor that fact without overstating their claim to it. A dim binary star system became Pair 1. A region of unusual gas clouds became the Long Breath. A planet with an unexpectedly stable atmosphere, orbiting a warm yellow star at just the right distance, was logged as Candidate 7 and flagged for follow-up. I spent my mornings reading intelligence reports that came in on a secure channel from Francis Cole's team in Geneva. I spent my afternoons talking with Calvin and his colleagues about what they were finding, and sometimes, late in the ship's evening cycle when the crew had gone to their rest rotations and the observation deck was quiet, I sat in front of the wide, curved viewport and looked at a piece of the universe that no one in the conclave even knew existed, and I thought about what we were building out here while the galaxy dealt with what we had left behind. What we had left behind was considerable. The intelligence reports from Francis were precise and, in places, very difficult to read. The Veth Dominion and the Sorrel Compact, 2 species that had been the most powerful and most frequently allied members of the conclave for 2 centuries, were in open conflict, not a trade dispute, not a diplomatic standoff. Open, declared, active conflict over territorial boundaries in the mid-sectors. Boundaries that had been maintained, for 60 years, by a series of human-brokered agreements that created economic incentives for both species to treat the shared zone between them as a cooperative resource rather than a contested frontier. The human-brokered agreements had expired with the withdrawal. No one had offered to replace them. I read those reports sitting at my usual spot near the viewport, and the feeling I had was not the one you might expect. It was not satisfaction, and it was not guilt. It was something quieter and harder to name. A kind of grief, I think, for the waste of it. 2 species that had managed, for 60 years, to choose cooperation over conflict, now choosing conflict because the architecture of cooperation had been built on our work, and we had taken the blueprints with us. I had known this would happen. The Bureau's analysts had modeled it, had given it an estimated probability and an estimated timeline, and the estimated probability had been high, and the estimated timeline had been approximately now. I had known it. Knowing it did not make it simple. On the 18th day of the voyage, something unexpected happened. Calvin came to find me in the observation deck at mid-morning, with the expression of a man who has encountered something he wants a second opinion on. "We have a contact," he said. The contact was a single vessel, civilian class, Veth configuration, broadcasting a standard non-military approach signal and a xenobiology research identifier. It had come from the direction of the nearest conclave outer station and had followed the Arlen Cross's ion trail, not aggressively, but steadily, for approximately 6 hours before getting close enough for a standard hail. Calvin's crew were tense. Protocol for unexpected contact in unmapped space was clear and had been extensively drilled. Hold position, identify the vessel, do not grant docking or boarding access without explicit authorization from the mission commander. I was not the mission commander. That was Calvin, but he was looking at me with the expression of someone who understood that the decision he was about to make had implications that went considerably beyond the Arlen Cross. I looked at the contact profile on his data screen. Veth Civilian Research Vessel, 6 crew, Xenobiology Institute identifier. No military markings. Broadcasting in clear, unencrypted signal, which was a choice that said, without words, "We are not trying to hide anything." "What do they want?" I asked. "They're asking if we'd be willing to talk," Calvin said. "And trade." Trade. I thought about that for a moment. There was no policy that covered this. The Bureau's mandate covered formal conclave contact, not an unaffiliated civilian vessel in unmapped space that had followed us out here to ask if we wanted to talk. "Grant them approach clearance," I said. "Docking on the secondary port. 2 crew members from their side, 2 from ours, in the external airlock, not the interior." Calvin nodded. He went to make the arrangements. The meeting happened an hour later. I attended as an observer, standing back from the airlock exchange, letting Calvin and his first officer conduct the initial contact. The 2 Veth crew members who came through were both young, by Veth standards, which put them in the equivalent of early career, and they moved with the slightly too careful body language of people who were very much aware that they were doing something their institution might not have approved. One of them was the team's senior researcher. Her name, in Veth phonology, was something I will transliterate as Vesa Rin. She spoke careful, slightly formal interspecies common with the accent of someone who had learned it from recordings rather than in conversation. She thanked Calvin for the docking access. She said her team had been following our ion trail because they were researching biological material in this unmapped sector and had not expected to encounter another vessel. Then she looked past Calvin and found me. She had clearly reviewed whatever records she could access about the Arlen Cross. She knew who I was. "Director Ellison," she said. "I'm an observer," I said. "Not a director anymore." She absorbed this. "Would you be willing to share a meal? There is a custom among my people, when 2 research teams meet in unmapped space, that the sharing of food serves as the formal acknowledgement that we are not in competition." I looked at Calvin. He gave me the small nod that meant, "Your call." 1 hour, I said, in the airlock common space. "Your provisions and ours." We sat on opposite benches in the airlock common space with a meal spread between us, their dried ration packs and ours, which were significantly better, and for 20 minutes we talked about the sector, the biology, the navigational challenges of working without established charts. The Veth researchers were, when they dropped the formal cadence, genuinely interesting people. Curious, careful, exactly the kind of scientists I had spent 9 years meeting in the margins of diplomatic sessions and never having time to actually talk to. Then Vesa Rin set down her food and said, quietly, without looking directly at me, "We did not know how much your people were doing for us. Most of us did not know." The airlock was very quiet. "I understand," I said. "We were taught that the conclave was built by all the species together, that each member contributed according to their capacity." She paused. "I have spent the last year reading the historical technical records. The real records, not the official summary." "What did you find?" She looked at me then. That the summary was very incomplete. I held her gaze. "Yes," I said. "It was." There was another silence. "What happens now?" she asked. Not in a political sense. Not a negotiating question. A genuine one. From someone young enough to still ask things directly. "That depends on the conclave," I said, "and on whether it becomes something different enough to have a different kind of conversation. And if it does, then we will have that conversation," I said, carefully, "on different terms." She nodded. I could tell she was filing this away, the way young researchers file away things they do not yet fully understand, but can tell will matter later. Calvin's team had developed, in the 2 weeks of the voyage, a working hypothesis about a region of gas cloud activity 3 days further into unmapped space that they thought might indicate a biologically active system. After the meal, I shared, at my discretion, the navigational data we had compiled on the region. Vessarin's team shared biological survey data from a sector adjacent to it that they had mapped before following our trail. It was the first exchange between a human team and a conclave-associated team in 5 years. It happened in an airlock, in unmapped space, over dried food. When their vessel undocked and moved away, I went back to the observation deck and sat for a long time looking at the dark. The conflict between the Veth Dominion and the Soral Compact was ongoing. 2 worlds that could have maintained their 60 years of cooperation had not. I had known this was coming, and it had still been hard to read. But out here, in unmapped space, a young Veth researcher had followed our trail because she was curious. She had asked to trade. She had admitted, plainly and without diplomatic cover, that she had not known, and that the not knowing mattered. That was not nothing. I thought about the formal message that had arrived from the Conclave Secretariat 4 days before I had boarded the Arlen Cross. It was a formal document, correctly formatted, transmitted through the official channel that the Bureau had established for exactly this type of communication. It was an offer to renegotiate the terms of human participation in the Conclave of Allied Worlds, with full voting rights restored and a formal reparations framework attached as an annex. The offer had been reviewed, in my absence, by the Bureau's Legal and Political Advisory Committee. The committee had acknowledged receipt, confirmed that the document had been logged in the official record, and noted that a response timeline would be established in due course. The document had been sitting, correctly and officially logged, for 4 days now. No one was rushing. No one was going to rush. There were things that needed to be true before a response was worth giving. The conflict in the mid-sectors needed to resolve itself, one way or another, without human intervention, because the galaxy needed to understand what it looked like when its own frictions were not being quietly managed by human diplomatic groundwork. The relay network needed to demonstrate, concretely, the extent of its degradation, and the conclave needed to decide, from the inside, whether it was capable of becoming something that deserved a different kind of partnership. That decision would not be made by us, but we would be watching, carefully, from a ship in unmapped space, adding to maps that the conclave didn't have, making contacts that the conclave didn't know about, building something that was not structured around the old terms. The stars outside the viewport were exactly the same stars they had always been. We were different. 10 years. That is how long it took, from the day I walked out of the conclave chamber to the day I sat in my house in a small town in Northumberland and watched the live feed of the first session of what was now being called, in its official founding documents, the Council of Sovereign Species, a name that had been argued over for 11 months and finally settled on because it contained, in each of its 3 words, exactly the thing the old conclave had most consistently failed to be. I was retired. I had formally retired from the Bureau 2 years earlier, after the conclave had dissolved its old structure, and the long process of building the replacement framework had moved into a phase that needed younger architects than me. Owen Price had stayed on. Francis Cole had become the head of what was now called the Human Strategic Liaison Office, which was a better name for the same function but with a very different mandate. Gregory Hale, my old deputy from the conclave days, was now a senior advisor to the human delegation in the new council. I was retired. I lived in Northumberland. I had a garden that required more attention than I gave it, a dog that required more exercise than I gave him, and a writing desk at which I had been working on this account for 14 months. On the day of the first session, I woke early, made tea, and sat down in front of the wall screen in my living room. The feed was already live. The pre-session coverage had been running for an hour, with commentary from broadcast teams on 4 different human channels and, interestingly, on 2 channels operated by Thari media organizations that had been given distribution access to the Human Broadcasting Network as part of the early-stage partnership agreements. The new council chamber looked nothing like the old conclave chamber. I had seen architectural renderings of it during its construction phase, But seeing it live and full of delegates was different. It was a circular space rather than a tiered one, with every delegation seated at the same height, at curved tables that radiated outward from a central open floor. The lighting was designed to be even across the whole space. No shadows, no zones of dim that separated the center from the margins. The human delegation was seated in the 8th position around the circle, which had been determined by a randomized draw conducted by a neutral party. Not the lowest, not the highest. The 8th position out of 31, because the Council had 31 founding members, of which 2 were the new civilizations that humanity had made contact with in the unmapped regions during the years of withdrawal. Species that the old conclave had never known existed, who had now been brought into the framework with human sponsorship and the clear expectation that they would be treated as full partners from the first day. This had been one of our conditions. I watched the human senior delegate take her seat. Her name was Priya Holt, and she was 34 years old, which made her roughly 20 years younger than I had been when I took my own seat in the old conclave chamber. She had been a student during the withdrawal. She had grown up in a world where the galactic community was something that had failed humanity and been made to understand why. She had no nostalgia for the old arrangement, no institutional habit of patience born of being in the room where the old compromises were made. She was fluent in 9 alien languages. She had spent 3 years working with the Thari diplomatic corps before returning to the human delegation. She looked, sitting at that table, like someone who had been born to sit exactly there. There was a pre-session moment in which delegates were settling, finding their positions, adjusting their translation systems. In that moment, I noticed the Veth delegation. They were smaller than they had been in the old conclave days. 2 of the Dominion's 7 member worlds had formally separated during the conflict years and were now independent delegates. The remaining 5 Veth worlds were represented by a quiet, careful group who had, in the preceding months of council negotiation, been consistently cooperative in ways that the Veth of the old conclave days almost never had been. Orath Tel was long gone. I did not know where he was, and had not looked. The high speaker of the new council, for its founding session, was the Thari representative Soft Stone, the same diplomat who had stood up in the emergency conclave broadcast 5 years ago and suggested that the member species should discuss what they had done to cause the withdrawal. She had been nominated jointly by 7 delegations. The human delegation had seconded the nomination. I had watched that moment, in the feed from the negotiation sessions, and felt something I could only describe as appropriate. Soft Stone opened the founding session with a statement that I will not reproduce in full here. It has been widely distributed and does not need my account to reach anyone who wants to read it. What I will note is that it was short, and it was honest. It described the history of the old conclave without the kind of careful diplomatic smoothing that usually softens such histories into stories where no one was really at fault. It named, plainly, the failures of the old structure. It named what those failures had cost, and it said, in clear language, that the Council of Sovereign Species existed because those failures had been confronted rather than buried. The chamber was very still while she spoke. Then the formal proceedings began. I had been sent, as a courtesy, the agenda for the founding session. I had read it the night before. The first item was the ratification of the founding charter, a document that had taken 3 years of drafting and 18 months of negotiation, and had been, at various points, described by the people working on it as impossible, almost impossible, nearly complete, essentially finished, and then, finally, done. The charter established the seating protocol, the voting rights, the dispute resolution mechanisms, and the scientific and cultural cooperation frameworks that would govern the Council's operations. Every member species, including humanity, had 1 vote. The charter could not be amended without the consent of 2/3 of the members, and no amendment could remove a member's voting rights. These were not revolutionary principles, they were obvious ones. The fact that they had needed to be argued for, clause by clause, against the resistance of species whose power in the old structure had depended on those principles not being applied consistently, said everything that needed to be said about what the old structure had been. The charter was ratified in the first hour, unanimous. After the ratification, there was a brief ceremonial exchange in which each delegation offered a formal statement of commitment to the Council's principles. Most of these were short, some were elegant. The Kasari delegation offered a long statement about the history of interspecies cooperation that was, by the midpoint, causing several delegates to check their translation systems because they could not determine whether the length was ceremonial or something had gone wrong with the scheduling. Then it was the human delegation's turn. Priya Holt stood up. She was the kind of person who did not perform calm. She simply was calm, in the way that people are calm who have decided, before they arrived, exactly what they are going to say and exactly why they are going to say it. She said that humanity was pleased to be a founding member of the Council of Sovereign Species. She said that we brought to this table the same curiosity, the same capacity for work, and the same willingness to collaborate that we had brought to the old conclave. She said that we also brought a very clear memory. She paused there. We do not hold that memory as a weapon, she said, but we will not put it down, because the thing a clear memory gives you is not bitterness. It gives you precision. It tells you, exactly and in detail, what went wrong before, so that you can choose, every day, not to let it go wrong again. The chamber was quiet. We are very glad to be here, Priya said, on these terms. She sat down. I watched the feed from my armchair in Northumberland and felt something move through my chest. Not quite what I would call pride, because pride is too simple a word for something that also contains years of difficult mornings and difficult decisions and difficult reports, and the face of a young Veth researcher in an airlock in unmapped space, saying we did not know. But close to pride. Close enough. There was one more moment I want to record. After the founding session concluded, and the feed shifted to commentary and delegate interviews, I switched channels and found an archive broadcast, one of the new Thari media feeds, running a historical documentary about the withdrawal period. I had not expected to watch it, but I found I could not look away. The documentary was honest in the way that good history is honest, not flattering to anyone, interested only in what actually happened and why. It interviewed former conclave officials, Bureau of Disengagement staff, xenobiologists, economists, ordinary people from 6 species whose daily lives had been disrupted by the consequences of the withdrawal. It was, as a piece of work, very well made. Near the end, it included footage I had not seen before. It was from a conclave archival camera, the kind used for internal record-keeping, not for broadcast. The footage was from the chamber on the day of the withdrawal vote, and it showed what had happened in the minutes after I walked out. The laughter had lasted approximately 40 seconds. I had not known that. It had felt longer, from inside it. Then the laughter had died away, and Orath Tell had said his line about the child at the dinner table, and there had been a brief second wave of amusement from the upper tiers. And then someone had asked, from the middle tier, in a voice that the translation system rendered as flat and entirely serious, what exactly are they withdrawing from? And for a moment, no one had answered. Because the question was simple, and the answer was complicated, and the chamber full of 30 alien species, species that had been treating humanity as a useful convenience for decades, had suddenly, in the silence after that question, become aware that they did not actually know the full answer, that they would have to go and find out, that finding out was going to take a while, and that while they were finding out, the humans would be gone. I closed the feed. Outside, it was raining in Northumberland. A real autumn rain, the kind that comes in sideways off the hills and makes the garden smell of wet earth and something older than memory. The dog was asleep on the rug. The tea was gone cold. I sat for a while in the quiet of my house and thought about the day I had walked out of that chamber. I thought about Gregory falling into step beside me in the corridor, saying nothing. I thought about the shuttle pulling away from the spire and the sound of the door closing behind me, that soft, pneumatic sigh. I thought about Nina asking if we were ever going back to the stars, and me telling her we were already there. We had just stopped sharing the view. We had shared it again now, on different terms, after 10 years of the galaxy learning, in the hardest possible way, what those terms needed to be. I stood up, took my cold tea to the kitchen, and put the kettle on again. Through the window, the rain was steady, and the hills were dark green, and the sky was the color of old pewter, and it was, in every way, just a Tuesday in Northumberland. We did not need the stars to survive. We had just needed the galaxy to remember that. And it had.